Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Bob Plankers. I'm a senior technical marketing architect at VMware, and I specialize in vSphere security and compliance. I'm joined today by Sanara Marsh, a technical product manager with our Carbon Black group. Today we want to run through Carbon Black Cloud Workload. It's a new tool that really makes it a lot easier to assess and prioritize risks from vulnerabilities in workloads themselves. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes, then I'm going to get out of the way so Sanara can show you the really interesting parts in a demo of all this. We worry a lot about security risks. You know, the proverbial hacker in the dark. I love this slide. You know, it's dark and hazy. I'm hoping nothing's on fire in that room. And, this sort of scenario might have been true a decade ago, might have been, well, it's certainly true in the movies, but it's not reality anymore. The truth now is that hacking groups are a heck of a lot more like businesses than anything else. They're very well organized. They've really earned the title of APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat. And some of the estimates of Russian APT groups are that they've got multiple thousands of people involved. They're scary because they infect organizations with ransomware, with malware that lets them in, and then this ransomware is actually kind of a people thing. It's scary because these people that control these and drive these infections and the attacks, they're patient. They infect a desktop somewhere, then they quietly map out the corporate network, map out what they've got access to. They try to escalate their privileges. They store all that information in a database somewhere. And, it's probably true, and we kind of know that it's true, that they've got better asset maps than most organizations because it's worth it to them. This is how they make money. And they find a place in your network to camp out, a quiet little corner somewhere where they can continue probing, and they wait. They sit and wait for the next vulnerability to pop up. Then, when that does, they prey on the lag time between the vulnerability disclosure and the patching cycles. That's not an instantaneous thing. Even in the organizations that have the fastest patching there's still some lag. And they prey on that. And that's what's scary. So what do we do about it? That's really the big question here. And I like this slide a lot. It's a Gartner slide. It's a good map of things that we need to be thinking about as we build out our environments. What do we need to do? What's more foundational? And it's generally been held in the security community that the two biggest things that you can do to secure an environment above everything else, the two things that matter most of all, is practicing good account and password hygiene and then patching. And we're not going to talk about account management. We're not going to talk about password hygiene. If we want that sort of thing, vSphere's got great options for it. But you look at the bottom of this slide. Hardening, configuration, and vulnerability management. Patching. That's a very foundation of everything. Patching is really the only way to truly remove a vulnerability from the environment. And you can sometimes work around it. You can install workarounds or mitigate things in certain ways, but eventually the workaround is more trouble than it's worth, and you just end up having to patch. Of course, there's a problem with this. There's always a catch, right? Figuring out what we need to patch. And if we've got 10 gallons of patching and only 5 gallons worth of time to do it, what do we do first? There's a lot of stuff in the environment, and between workloads and the infrastructure itself, the infrastructure we can see, maybe some infrastructure we can't see, networking and fabrics and things like that, there's a lot of attack surface. So where do you start? There's a favorite saying of ours at VMware here, and you've probably heard us say it. We say it often enough, that security is a team sport. And you might roll your eyes. Please don't. I spent 23 years out in enterprise IT, and I actually believe this. Security is a team sport. I tend not to like the sayings that, like if you're not with us, you're against us. And security is a little bit like that, like where everyone's got to be kind of aligned and on the same page. And it is a team sport. And for me, it depends on what kind of team you pick. Maybe not a basketball team. I like basketball, but maybe a swim team. And you've got different groups. You've got InfoSec overdoing, medley relay, and then you've got the sysadmins off with the freestyle and all that stuff. But they're all pulling to win the meet, right? They're all wanting the organization to succeed. And that's really a realization that we've been able to make, and that we point out a lot too, that the organizational structure will always exist. because it has to. These organizations, these teams have got different roles. The InfoSec team does not do the same thing as the vSphere admins, and intentionally so. The vSphere admins don't do the same thing as InfoSec. That organizational structure will always exist, but the silos, the hard boundaries, the not working together, the walls that you chuck stuff over at each other, those don't have to exist. There's really these common goals. Preventing breaches. Both groups want to prevent breaches. No sysadmin said, hey, let's have a breach today. I'm feeling bored. That just doesn't happen. And so common goal. Pass audits. If your organization works in a regulated environment, regulated industry, audits are a thing. Compliance is a thing, and you've got to demonstrate that you're doing a good job with this. It's part of the deal. You want to run a nuclear power plant? There's NERC SIP. If you want to take credit cards, there's PCI DSS, and PCI DSS 6.2 says you've got to patch. So again, 10 gallons of patching in a 5-gallon time pail, how's that going to work? Well, you can prioritize, hit the big stuff first. Eliminate incidents. That helps. Nobody wants to get called in the middle of the night because something's wrong. There's a Bitcoin miner running on a web server somewhere. Not that I'm bitter about it, but, you want to eliminate that sort of thing. And really, we want to drive efficiency more than anything else and it's going to sound weird coming from a guy in my position, but security is all overhead. It does not move an organization forward, right? It keeps an organization from moving backwards really fast, but it's very much like an insurance policy in that regard. And so where we can help our customers with tools and technology and tactics, tools, tactics, and procedures, that's an InfoSec thing, where we can help customers improve their efficiency, we can get IT staff back to work faster on things that matter more to an organization to move them forward. So this is where Carbon Black Cloud Workload really comes in. It's something I really like a lot, and I wish it existed back when I was a sysadmin. It's a single tool that both the security and sysadmin teams can use to respond and assess, really assess vulnerabilities and risk. It doesn't actually do the patching for you, but it really tells you where it guides your hand, And faster communication. I think back to when I was doing this stuff. I talk a lot about this, and this is what drives my excitement for this tool. Is that I think back to when I had security analysts, our SOC guys, show up in my office and say, hey, Bob, so-and-so, we've got this new big vulnerability. And because there's always something, right? There's always a big vulnerability looming, because it's software and it's just the way it is. What do we have that's vulnerable to it? I don't know. I really don't know. So they've got a scan. And we take their scan and we compare it to my CMDB, and I've got some stuff they don't have, and they have some stuff I don't have, and there's some mismatched things, and that just takes time, and again, the attackers are preying on that lag time between vulnerability disclosure and remediation, patching. So if we can lower that, we've got a common set of data, we've got a common tool that's always scanning and always looking at our environment to tell us where our risks are. We can just turn to it and see what it thinks. Both teams can do that. There's a couple of different interfaces. There's a cloud interface. There's the vSphere plugin, vSphere client plugin that the vSphere admins can use and drill right down inside the vSphere environment itself. Very tightly coupled to vSphere tools, VMware tools, things like that. And then you can make better, so not only do you drive down response time, you make better decisions together because you've got the time to do it, right? And this leads to improved hygiene. I talked just a minute ago about, being able to catch problems, being able to eliminate incidents, being able to prioritize, and that's really important. The other thing that sticks out in my mind is something that I've seen in my history too, is the ability to catch gaps where you think you've got everything covered, but you really don't. And vSphere is just absolutely loaded with risk mitigation features. In fact, we don't talk about it nearly enough, but vSphere has pretty much every feature in vSphere is aimed at reducing or eliminating risk in some way. One of those things is snapshots. And I had a bunch of app admins that I showed them how snapshots worked, and they loved it because it mitigated risk with their updates. We had a group that tied their app updates to, they'd also do OS patching at the same time. But if their app update failed, and sometimes it did, or they didn't like what it was doing, they'd revert it. That also meant that they reverted the security updates too. And so we would need to catch that. We would only catch that on the next scan. How is that going to be days or weeks between the next one and now? Who knows? And a tool like Carbon Black Workload sees it immediately, can flag that. Hey guys, we've got a problem. And then if it's not an emergency, you can just deal with the risks as you see fit. And so moving forward, two other things that I really want to mention: consolidated vendors, reducing operational complexity, reducing the number of tools in an environment. That's really important. Even IT tools, they're all overhead. All those things that we install to help ourselves, they're all applications. They need care and feeding too, just like the HR system, just like the general ledger or a web server, that sort of thing. And so where we can eliminate those, where we can consolidate tools, that's a big win. Again, efficiency. And then last is reporting. I was a sysadmin, and no news is good news, right? That's how sysadmins sort of operate. And, that's great until somebody asks you, to justify your existence. And so IT costs money. All these sorts of things cost money. You want to show progress. And so how do you do that with a normal tool? Well, a bunch of different ways, but it's really actually fairly easy to do in the Carbon Black Cloud Workload tools. Good reporting, you can show the number of vulnerabilities you had, and then on a month-by-month basis or whatever time interval, you can show that you're making progress. You can show that, during an audit, you can show that you don't have many vulnerabilities or that they're under control, they're being remediated, that sort of thing. And so that's really important. So anyhow, thank you for listening to me. Let's go over to Sonara, and she's going to show you what's what.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. So we're going to transition over here to my screen. You should be able to see vSphere up now. And what we want to walk through is a product demonstration of Carbon Black Workloads. And I think it's important to understand some of the components that we're looking to enable, because some of the challenges that Bob had brought up or different nuances that he was mentioning here is what we want to be able to simplify with this workload operating agent. And we are now a part of VMware. This is a big driving factor for us, because when we were operating as Carbon Black, there were obviously different advantages that we were playing here. But what we need to do is we need to be integrated into VMware and start looking at ways to fundamentally secure the infrastructure in a less complex manner with better efficiency, supporting stronger operational outcomes. And so what we're viewing here right now is the built-in Carbon Black component into vSphere. And what happens fundamentally is that Carbon Black cloud services are actually built into VM tools, so that from an enablement standpoint, what you now have the capability to do is look at your complete virtual inventory, be able to determine where Carbon Black exists or does not exist currently, and you have the capability to one-click deploy or update this agent on those assets. Now, when I say agent, this is enabling those services on that virtual asset, so you don't actually have to manage any sort of agent deployment. This is turning on those services. We work end-to-end with VMware's engineering team in order to test performance before and after deployment of Carbon Black on these virtual assets. We understand how critical it is to optimize performance on these assets. That's why we need to be integrated fully in with VMware. And those are some of the unique vantage points that we will have over our competitors in this space. We are tested end-to-end with the Horizon engineering team. We have unique registry keys to allow us to remove any re-registration script that can start to explore supporting things like instant clones. We are focused here with workloads on those virtual servers to make sure that they are up to date and they are protected from this asset inventory perspective. Now, you can at any point in time go to your hosts and clusters to view from a complete asset view or a lower level asset view of the Carbon Black status as well. And you can update it on a one-off basis as opposed to that collected view that we saw previously here. This is really our insight in, or our view into, how we can help IT operationalize security within your environment. Because once deployed to those assets, Carbon Black has built-in tamper protection to ensure that we can't be disabled or modified by any end user. So this is ensuring that once it's deployed, your virtual assets are now protected and secured by Carbon Black Cloud. Now, in this Carbon Black plugin, what you're also going to notice is that we surface some other metrics here that I think are very key in driving us to start minimizing the operational silos between IT and security. And what we've surfaced here is our vulnerability assessment capabilities. Now, the comments that we've heard from customers in the past is that typically the IT team needs to wait for security to schedule some sort of vulnerability scan. Once that scan happens, let's say it's monthly, they will then provide those list of 1,000 different critical vulnerabilities that they would like to see patched on their assets. And what the statistic actually comes back is that only 1 in 10 vulnerabilities are patched. So the question then becomes, if I've got thousands of vulnerabilities identified, how do I understand which ones are the most critical and which ones are going to drive the most impact in the cases of where we can actually remediate them? So what we do with the Carbon Black vulnerability assessment piece is, in a simple manner here, we're actually pulling forward these critical vulnerabilities prioritized by that CVS score. But we also optimize these metrics by prioritizing it not only by criticality, but also exploitability. This is crucial for everyone to actually complete their job in an efficient manner, because now what we are asking on top of the criticality is we can ask questions like, is there an active breach utilizing this vulnerability? Is this occurring in the wild? Does this exploit actually leverage malware? Because we know that malware has become more fundamentally detrimental and destructive to environments. That should increase that criticality. And the third question is it easily exploitable, right? Do they have to deploy additional tool sets, or is this something that can be readily available with this exploit just existing on this asset? So by asking those three fundamental questions, we can start to prioritize these critical vulnerabilities by exploitability as well, so that rather than looking at a list of 2,700 vulnerabilities, what you've now been prioritized around is what's going to drive the greatest impact in your organization based on the time that you guys have. So now we only have 2 assets with 2 product vulnerabilities. Now, it's also important to understand how we're pulling this information, because when we're looking at these different vulnerabilities, this isn't something where you are scheduling any sort of resource-intensive scan on your assets. This information is actually provided in near real time for your information. So we leverage our tool, what is called OS Query. Creates a virtualized database of your operating system so that we have access to what applications currently exist on those assets, what operating system you're running on, as well as application versions, so that when a new exploit is created or identified, we don't have to wait for an engineer to create any sort of signature, for them to then push it to you guys to wait for that scheduled scan, to hope that all of your assets are on the network, and then to be able to prioritize that. We simply say, okay, we have this data. Let's then correlate it with what this vulnerability is saying so that we can instantly identify where that may exist in your environment and give you that risk score based on criticality. Now, this is important too, because it is something that is unified between security and IT. So this isn't something that you just have exposure to in vSphere. This is something that the security team also has these unified insights. So now I've pulled up the Carbon Black Cloud here. And what you're going to notice is that we've got these same vulnerabilities existing. 2 critical vulnerabilities, 2,700 total vulnerabilities. And this is really important because let's say, in the example that Bob brought up around zero logon, let's say that vulnerability does exist still in your environment. And for whatever reason, even though this is highly critical, easily exploitable, let's say that you have not been able to patch this particular vulnerability. The security team needs to be able to understand the level of risk that they're introducing to their critical assets. They can reevaluate at any point in time to understand in real time if patches have been successfully applied. But if not, what they'll likely want to do in this case is elevate the privileges or the policy level, protection level here on these assets that have these critical vulnerabilities. So these unified insights are very key for both teams to drive better operational outcomes. The security team can also schedule queries on the environment to make sure that they're understanding the full scope of this particular threat. So if we look at some of the queries that we can schedule here, we can look for that zero logon vulnerability, understand where it's matched and not matched as well. So I've got 8,000 assets where this still exists, right? That's something that we need to start asking that question on: how do we elevate that permissions level to make sure that this isn't something that gets exploited? And having those insights is important for both IT and security. Now, once you're enabled on these assets, it's also important to understand what you have access to here, right? Because Carbon Black deploys different module services. We do operate from the security context, so everything we deploy is going to either impact how you identify risk, how you prevent against adversarial threats, or how security detects and responds to those threats. So when we think about deploying this to these assets, right, we've got Carbon Black enabled on my assets. We're protected in just our standard protection policy here. What's important to drive home is that we want to make sure that these assets are protected with minimal operational impact. And what we typically see is that ransomware and adversarial threats will follow a multi-phase approach. It'll typically start with something like initial access or recon and infiltrate. So what people will typically do, or adversaries will typically do, is they'll send your users a spear phishing campaign, right? This is not something that is, I would say, wildly unexpected, right? It's one of the #1 initial access techniques to gain access to your environment. And so ransomware like TrickBot or even Bazaar Loader will attempt to leverage these spear phishing campaigns to gain initial access. But if you have Carbon Black enabled on these systems, we can protect against those advanced exploits with our cloud reputation, right? So nothing crazy here, signature-based lookups, machine learning-based lookups. It's something to protect you right out of the gate. But let's say access was attained. Let's say for whatever reason, this doesn't get recognized from a cloud signature standpoint. What we deploy is an additional set. We have multiple layers for a defense in-depth strategy on prevention. So the next phase that an adversary will typically do is they'll move to maintain and manipulate phases, where they want to continue improving their position through credential scraping and leveraging native binaries like PowerShell to gain a foothold in the environment. So a popular example that we've seen adversaries use here is APT29. Now, APT29 deploys many different techniques. What I want to be able to simulate here is how we would be able to maintain and manipulate the environment through credential scraping. So if I'm just going to run something locally here in terms of encoded PowerShell. I'm going to attempt to scrape credentials in my environment as a part of this native binary and see how Carbon Black can actually protect in this case. What you're going to see is that instantly this does get shut down based on that credential scraping behavior. So we deploy a multitude of different techniques outside of cloud reputation. We also have behavioral analytics, and we have hooks into the native OS feature of AMSI so that we can analyze encoded scripts to be able to terminate malicious script execution as well, making our behavioral analytics even more powerful. Now, again, let's say that is even successful. Let's say we are still navigating through here as an adversary. What then will happen as the final stage here is typically execute and exfiltrate. So ransomware such as Ryuk here as well as other examples, I believe, is like Conti. But what they will attempt to do is they'll attempt to distribute across the network, so things like lateral movement here, and then they will attempt to encrypt and destroy data for maximum impact. So in order to protect against these types of threats, let's say that they don't trigger based on signature, because I've embedded this in a PowerShell script, so it's a native OS binary. It's not using any encoded PowerShell, so it's not leveraging our AMSI scripting prevention. But what we have is additional ransomware protection. So if we run this here, so that if this actually, this pulls up here, if it starts to attempt to encrypt contents within your environment or exploit any native binaries as mentioned before, what we will do is we will go in and restrict that activity. If it attempts to start encrypting file contents, we fully shut down this complete shell session as well here. Now, what we want to be able to see in the Carbon Black Cloud is how this will look for the security team as well, ultimately understanding that the goal here is enhanced protection. So I'm going to switch over to this view here and take a look at our process tree so that you can take a look at what the security team would have insight into. Now, the benefit is increased time to value. So for the security team, it's decreasing that time to detect, it's decreasing that time to respond. And they have insight into this complete process tree. So they can see that Outlook was trying to open this TrickBot document. It is listed as no malware, so Cloud Reputation steps in. We have different PowerShell instances that are populated here as well. If we click in on these instances, what you're going to notice for the security team is that we also have powerful reveal features. So I ran that encoded command line locally here. But what we do for our security administrators through reveal is we can actually show them what exactly this script was intending to do to save them time and increase time to value. So at the end of the day, what we're enabling through workloads and through our Carbon Black Cloud offering is the ability for our team to have operational insights, increase time to value by deploying right through vSphere, understand and harden against those different vulnerabilities that may exist in their environment, and ensure that the security team has adequate level of visibility to protect, detect, and respond to adversarial threats on your critical workloads. So with that, thank you for your guys' time today.